Modern science can't prove karma. It doesn't give us evidence that karma exists, but recent discoveries certainly make it more plausible. Any contemporary physicist will tell you there's empirical evidence that everything is connected. There's this thing Einstein called spooky action at a distance, where, things on the subatomic level affect things on the subatomic level at insane distances that can't be necessarily explained. Nikola Tesla, he once said, this is over 100 years ago, if you want to find the secrets of the universe, think in terms of energy, frequency, and vibration. Karma can be used as an excuse for having a callous or indifferent attitude toward the suffering of other people. Well, it's their karma. Your karma is you're aware of that suffering, and you're choosing to be callous instead of compassionate. And if you're in a position to help and you don't, that's a different kind of karma. Eastern traditions then go further, and they say it's not just about the action itself or the speech itself. What is the intention underlying it? What is the motivation? What is the thought process? What are the emotions? So those internal conditions are fundamental and foundational to the outward actions and the outward speech. Someone, has a car accident, bad karma. In the popular songs, it's, you done me wrong, and now karma's going to get you. On T-shirts, karma's a bitch. It's more like scientific principles. Energy being emitted and having consequences, like every action has an equal and opposite reaction, applied to human behavior and human consciousness, not just physical objects. It's in that sense not a judgmental system so much as just a system of energy and causes and effects.
I'm really excited to talk to you about your new book, Karmic Relief, which I've had, the great joy of reading through, and I have a number of questions, of course, that we'll explore. I guess just to begin with, the listeners of Chitheads are familiar with you because I have interviewed you twice before. I think both times in relation to a new book. Well, the first time was not a new book, but it was on American Veda, which was your breakout hit.
I became an overnight sensation after 30 years of writing.
I mean, it's amazing. Still to this day, it really covers a really important historical territory. And you're really quite talented at exploring and summarizing a kind of historical period that is not only, you do it also at the beginning of Karmic Relief and to a shorter degree, managing to cover a lot of historical territory, giving a lot of information, while at the same time it being such a pleasure to read. So you really are a good writer, which is not something that you can say about all spiritual writers.
No, you can't. And you can't say it about academics.
That's true. Very true. So what kind of inspired you to write this book on karma, which of course, as we'll discuss, is such a broad-ranging topic that of course has roots in Indian traditions, but has become a cultural, it is grown far beyond its roots. So what was your inspiration to write this book in the first place?
Honestly, the title, Karmic Relief, came decades before the book, because back in the 80s, when there were these Comic Relief TV specials to raise money for various charities, I jokingly started using the term karmic relief. And then at a certain point I said, hey, that would make a good book title. And wasn't sure what the book would be, but the subject of karma has been intriguing to me ever since I first started exploring the philosophies and spiritualities that were born in India. So they would show up when I read about Buddhism and Zen and Vedanta and yoga. And I struggled with it because I liked the idea that there may be cosmic justice at work and that we actually might reap what we sow, good and bad. it made a certain sense to me, but the evidence, I didn't see evidence. I was a pragmatic seeker, and I liked, something to comport with my experience and whatever other evidence I could marshal. But over time, it grew on me, and I kind of felt, well, no one's ever going to prove or disprove that karmic law is as described in the texts. But I kind of sense that there may be some truth in it, and if I have to make a choice, I'll err in the direction that it is, because then I'll behave myself better. But I was always intrigued by the subject. And then over time, researching my books and just keeping an eye on things as an observer of the spiritual landscape, I started to see the term being used more and more in the press, sports reports, TV commercials, brand names, and popular music. I mean, I remember John Lennon's Instant Karma, but over the decades, more and more songs came out with karma in the title or in the lyrics. And then Taylor Swift cut a song called Karma. And I said, okay, that does it. And I had been thinking of writing the book and using the title. And I put it off, and my wife and my agent kept saying, you should write the book about karma. And then finally I said, okay, I have to do it. And one of the reasons, it wasn't just that it had become part of our vocabulary, but also that it was being mostly used in a naive way and in a kind of a way that, sort of gets the sense of what karma is, but incompletely, you could say, and sometimes misused. So I thought, well, let's set the record straight and tell people why it's a useful concept and how it might be useful in their own lives to be aware of it.
Beautiful. So before we get into why it's useful, I'd love for you to just speak about the, let's say, misconceptions of karma. And I'm sure, there are many of them, as we know, but what would you say are the most misleading characterizations of karma by contrast with how the Indian traditions intended it?
Well, in popular use, it's kind of seen as a system of retribution, and you only hear about it in the context of something negative or undesirable happening. Someone, has a car accident, bad karma. In the popular songs, it's invariably, well, with some exceptions, you done me wrong, and now karma's going to get you. On T-shirts, karma's a bitch. It's always about retribution for misbehavior. But in fact, as the theories of karma would suggest, everything in the manifest world is that everything that occurs is the cause of effects, has consequences, and that they will come back. All the good stuff is also karma. But people don't say that. They fall in love. They don't say, what good karma. Somebody dumps them, it's bad karma. So that's one thing. And along those same lines, it's probably because of our conditioning in the West with this concept of a judgmental God figure. We think of things as reward and punishment. So karma is often understood that way, as a system of, like a judicial system where sentences are given out for different forms of behavior or misbehavior usually. And rewards are doled out like Santa Claus. But it's not a good way to think of it. It's more like, well, two things. One is it's more like scientific principles, more like the laws of nature that physics and biology describe, causes and effects, energy being emitted and having consequences, like the every action has an equal and opposite reaction applied to human behavior and human consciousness, not just physical objects. So it's in that sense not a judgmental system so much as just a system of energy and causes and effects. And that is also understood in what some scholars will call the evolutionary model of karma, where built into the system is learning and growth, so that the things that happen to us are kind of like, whether good or bad, lesson plans. We're evolving beings, growing toward freedom and liberation and greater awareness, greater capacity for love, all the things that we attribute to spiritual growth. And karma is the system of, it presents us with our curriculum. If we learn the right lessons, we matriculate, we move on to the next grade, so to speak. If we don't, we have to repeat the course. And everybody knows, and you don't even have to think about karma. You just have to be, any good psychotherapist will tell you, we tend to repeat the same mistakes until we snap out of it and move ahead. So karma is like that. The same situations will arise because we have not transformed our behavior. So those are the kind of things. And also that it's not determinism or fatalism. Yeah. It assumes freedom of choice, free will. We could argue forever about whether the free will is real or just seems to be, that we make choices and we have freedom. But nevertheless, that's our experience. And we get to modify our karma, change our karma by our actions in the present. And so those are the kind of the principal ones that keep coming back. And there's others that just sort of manifest themselves, one of which I think you'll appreciate, which is very often karma can be used as an excuse for having a callous or indifferent attitude toward the suffering of other people. Well, it's their karma. And you've even seen arguments saying, well, it's their karma to be suffering. That group is suffering. They seem to be taking advantage of, but it's really their karma from past lives and all that. And we should not interfere, because then we'd be interfering with the lesson plan. They have to work out their karma, which to me is just an excuse for being indifferent. Because when that comes up, I've taken to say to people, that may be true, but your karma is you're aware of that suffering and you're choosing to be callous instead of compassionate. And if you're in a position to help and you don't, that's a different kind of karma than doing the right thing. It could get complicated, but those are some of the misconceptions.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the callous sort of judgments of other groups of people. I remember it was in my first teacher training, I asked, okay, well, what does this mean about an entire group of people who've experienced genocide, for example? Does this doctrine or idea of karma suggest that they've all collectively done something to quote unquote deserve this? And the answer that this particular teacher gave, who I won't name, was entirely unsatisfactory to me. It was more like, well, karma is beyond the scope of our understanding, which felt like such a cop-out in a certain kind of way. I'll jump to another kind of point that I was inspired by when you were speaking. One of the things that I recently, I don't know if I would say discovered, but sort of learned or someone introduced me to, was that even though many people in the kind of modern yoga world understand or think of Indian or yoga philosophy as being quite doctrinal, or there's sort of these set, themes and concepts, and, Hinduism is this and so on and so forth. But actually, when we look at the Indian philosophy traditions, there's really very few axioms that aren't debated. And this is very fascinating because it just shows how speculative and rigorous the reasoning was. But the two things that are axiomatic in the tradition, they are karma and reincarnation. And even though they are categorized, as you so beautifully put in your book, that one area where you talk about these different elements of karma, even though they may be categorized in a certain way, the fundamental premise is not, nevertheless, that karma exists. It's very interesting with such a speculative, rational, philosophical set of critical schools of inquiry why this was just a sort of self-validating, obvious thing. And I think you so beautifully explained already why in terms of karma that is, because if we just take away all the moralistic mumbo jumbo, it is simply the law of cause and effect, and we can all observe that it's there. But I think it's quite interesting then to think about reincarnation, because that feels like it requires some, for us at least, where we are situated, it requires a kind of leap of faith. And yet for them, it was self-evident.
Yeah.
And so this is just so interesting. So I'm wondering what you think about this idea. Why, maybe we've already touched on, or you've already touched on why karma is sort of self-evident as an axiom, a philosophical, everyday experienced axiom. Why then reincarnation, which is not always disentangled from karma? It's usually implied.
Yeah, and I've encountered people who are prepared to accept karma to a degree because some cause and effect in our human existence is obvious. Certain things, you do something, something happens, and it's like instant karma, obvious karma. You insult somebody, they get angry, and they do something to you. Okay, but some of it is really subtle and unprovable and maybe not so self-evident. And that comes back to usually why so many righteous and moral people suffer and why bad people, misbehaving people, live long and prosper.
And become an high elected office.
Yes. Yes. And there are torturous reasoning about that, even in the Western tradition as well, because they have to somehow justify you reap what you sow. So keeping human life restricted to one incarnation would somehow not do the trick unless you're prepared to say, okay, in this one life that we get, karma is operative, but it's so subtle, we can't judge it because, like those misbehaving, powerful people that you alluded to, they may be miserable inside. They may be unloved. They may be disrespected. Even Ralph Waldo Emerson talked about that and how that they can't escape that internal suffering. But that assumes such people have a conscience, or that they're capable of feeling bad or noticing how people feel about them. That's why it's so difficult to explain or to justify that laws of karma are in effect if you don't include multiple. I just quoted Bindo on that, where he says, it's evident that in one life we do not and cannot labor out and exhaust all the values and powers of that life, but only carry on a past thread, weave out something in the present, prepare infinitely more for the future. So it makes sense to reason and rationality that we would have multiple lives to learn all the lessons and to reap the good and bad karma that's generated by our actions. So they go hand in hand, and it's hard to justify karma without reincarnation. But is it self-evident? To some degree, karma is self-evident. Certainly reincarnation is something that requires a leap of faith. And to me, even karma requires a certain leap of faith because we have to somehow explain the innocent suffering, unjustified suffering, inexplicable suffering, and the miscreants who get away with everything. And it's hard to do without a series of lives in which the laws of nature will play out.
I wonder, just to kind of belabor this point about the self-evident nature of karma, on one level, right, we can maybe distinguish between what is immediate to our experience, like the fact that if I push something, it will fall over. If I roll a ball, it continues to roll. Just in terms of my own psychology, if I continuously repeat to myself that I'm a loser, I'm going to feel like a loser, and that's going to shape my life in a particular way. So we have this sort of innate understanding that certain choices that we make have a result, and it's kind of obvious in that way. And yet our philosophy of causality is actually very linear. Mm-hmm. And that is a historically situated conception. And I think when we look to the ancient traditions, there's not only is there linear causality, there's also vertical causality, and then there's perhaps diagonal causality. I mean, there's causality coming from all directions.
That's
So
right.
then there's a sense in which there's an immediate understanding of how choice X leads to result Y. And then there's this experience, and this will lead us to our next question, where, seemingly when we've chosen to do something or we've performed our lives in a particular way and we think that that should lead to certain kind of results, suddenly the opposite happens, or some completely unknown and unforeseeable political circumstance or cultural circumstance emerges, or a thief storms into our house and does something terrible. And so this feels like it's sort of out of alignment, and yet the idea of karma, at least as I understand it, is that there's a fructification happening of karmic seeds from all kinds of directions, and it's not individually localized. It's not purely a sort of self-projective mechanism, right? I'd love your thoughts on that, but you emphasize in the book that karma is universal, as I was just kind of suggesting, but not selective. So how should people understand their life events that seem unrelated to their actions, like Lily's story about missing her mother's passing?
Yeah. The mistake people often make, and I've seen it so many times, and I did it myself, and before certain lessons hit home, was to think, this is happening, therefore I must have done X in the past. That is, the assumption that a particular action will lead to a specific consequence. Life is too complicated for that. So in some cases, yes, I run a red light, I have an accident, I did something careless, I did something mean-spirited, this happens. Sometimes it's obvious, but certain things, as you say, they come out of nowhere. You can speculate, and that's that's the mistake people make. Oh, this is happening. My house was broken into. I must have been a thief in my previous life, or I must have done something dishonest, and this is how it's coming back to me. Well, maybe it's a confluence of many, many actions that occurred over the course of whatever span of time we can, come up with, that interacts with the actions of other people, the people close to us, of strangers, of past lives, if you want to go that far back. It's all this mix of energy. And that's why in the Bhagavad Gita, it said that karma is unfathomable or difficult to understand. There's different translations. And I take that to mean, and various experts, gurus, and scholars who concur, that he's referring to the subtleties, the nuances, the minutiae of karma. This is beyond our comprehension. We can't trace back everything that happens to a single cause. And the metaphor that I use in the book, and I can't claim to have made it up, but it's one that hit home for me, is that if you were to drop a pebble into a still pond, science can predict the amplitude and frequency of the waves, the ripples that are emanated, and it will hit a shore and come back. And that's predictable. But if you drop a handful of pebbles in rapid sequence and then have other people drop pebbles, it becomes a chaotic mess and you lose sight of the first pebble. And that's what life is like. We're constantly making choices, making decisions, saying things, doing things. Those actions mix with the actions of the people we come in contact with, the people we speak to, the people we act with, the people we live with. They do things that affect our karma. Natural events happen like earthquakes and hurricanes. Collective karma happens in our families, our neighborhoods, our countries, that all affect us. Our actions affect everything else. And so assigning a particular cause to a particular event becomes, for the most part, impossible. And that's, to me, liberating. And I think it's certainly useless to just speculate. I don't, in the circles like people like you and I have traveled in, you've probably heard many people say, oh, so-and-so must have been whatever in a previous life, or I was so-and-so in a previous life, or I had this occupation or whatever. Usually nothing ordinary.
Exactly.
You're in London now, so you'll appreciate the fact that I once knew two different women who claimed to have been Mary, Queen of Scots.
Oh my gosh. Well, that sort of, I love that. But I almost feel like that, in a way, corresponds to what to me has often felt like a more compelling way of understanding reincarnation if we follow the logic, or at least one way we could follow the logic of some of what is being articulated. First of all, to go back to that idea of it being seemingly a leap of faith for our culture, part of that is because we have this sort of reductive materialist worldview where the personality is a epiphenomenal appearance of a kind of fundamentally physical thing. And therefore, when the physical thing dies, that bubble of a thing disappears, right? So, and that's purely grounded in our own worldview, our own metaphysical kind of worldview, materialist worldview. But if you kind of look to the Indian traditions, like you see a very different picture where psychophysical substance is not separate from each other. And what transmigrates is the subtle body, which is a subtler thing than the physical body. And you can see evidence of it, according to some people who try to explain, by taking the example of babies, twins, triplets, who come out, exact same circumstances, and illustrate or demonstrate a diversity of personalities way before they've received enough socialization to actually become those individual personas. Yeah. So, and this is very beautiful. And of course, some people could find some materialist explanation for it, I'm sure, but it is a compelling kind of case for that.
As is, if I may add, Jacob, and there's people trying to do, who have been doing systematic empirical analyses of these things. And the other mysterious thing that lends credence to reincarnation is children born with remarkable skill sets or tendencies, gifts, you could say. Where does that come from? And some evidence of, the University of Virginia, where people are studying these things, of little children describing memories that can then be investigated and that align with verifiable facts, like a name that they remember from a previous life, a location, an event like going down in a plane in World War II or something. And so there's some mounting evidence that points to reincarnation. And so who knows, someday maybe it'll be more than a leap of faith.
I feel like it's already sort of many people, like you said in your book, I thought this was so fascinating. This is obviously not reincarnation, but the fact that 55% of people in the United States said they believed in karma. Yeah. Obviously, probably not the karma we're necessarily talking about, but like pretty incredible. There is this intuition that we've been here before, and about both your ex-girlfriends being Mary Queen of Scots. Is it sort of, if we imagine that reincarnation is, if everything is sort of a recycling of energy, right? No energy ever leaves the system. This is, I don't know, some scientific platitude from something. Not a scientist.
Neither gained nor lost or something.
Right. And so if we imagine that the karmic congealment of a personality or a soul or a subtle body is some kind of energy, and energy is always recycled, then one can imagine that when that kind of organization of energy that is localized in a particular body, when it leaves the body, perhaps some aspect of that energy goes into another body, and some, maybe in the next lifetime, there's going to be a body that includes the Phil body, part of the previous Phil and Jacob energy constitution.
Right.
Will be hybridized. And and so I think, so that to me feels almost like a much more compelling and maybe even continuous with at least some aspects of the tradition notion of reincarnation, rather than this idea that your like personality, you're like little Jacob, little Phil, pop out of this one and pop into a next one in this kind of purely linear, continuous way.
Yeah. Earlier you talked about that karma and reincarnation are consistent in all the different Indic traditions. I mean, Sikhs, Jains, Buddhists, Hindus, it's there in each one. Yeah. But there's differences in the nuances, and there are differences within the traditions. So there are different models of reincarnation, different explanations. Buddhists and Hindus argue all the time, is there a soul, what we call a soul, a jiva, an entity that on some subtle level is Jacob in this incarnation and will be something else. That metaphor in the Gita of the dweller in the body shedding a body like we shed a garment and put on a new one. Maybe that's too simplistic. The Buddhist model is much more subtle, and it, disavows an individual soul, but yet something gets reborn. Some consistency is still somehow moves from one incarnation to another. So the fact of reincarnation, the fact of karma is consistent, but then there's debate and different models and different theories. I find that comforting, that it's not a uniform model. There's different models of what takes place between lives and all this sort of stuff. But one thing you alluded to, and this is important, is to get away from the materialistic assumption of physicality and discrete, solid objects.
Yeah.
And this is modern science. I say in the book that modern science can't prove karma. It doesn't give us evidence that karma exists. But recent discoveries certainly make it more plausible. Mm-hmm. So we know, for example, any contemporary physicist will tell you there's empirical evidence that everything is connected. You couldn't have a karmic justice system if everything were not connected, if we were somehow separate entities and all that. But everything is connected. And we also know there's this thing Einstein called spooky action at a distance, where, things on the subatomic level affect things on the subatomic level at insane distances that can't be necessarily explained. And so I found this quote from Nikola Tesla. He once said, this is over 100 years ago, if you want to find the secrets of the universe, think in terms of energy, frequency, and vibration. So that kind of says a lot, because what are we except energy, frequency, and vibration? What are the molecules and atoms and subatomic particles? It's all energy and vibration. And so when we do something, if I throw a ball or wave my hand, it throws energy out in form of vibration, and that vibrates. And it's not hard to imagine the vibration coming back to me in some form. Why not apply that to speech and to thought and to our feelings and attitudes? You could say, oh, that's taking place in the brain, but what's happening in the brain? It's energy and vibration. Why should it stay in our skulls? It's not implausible to think this stuff goes out there and has consequences.
This idea of the brain of being the source of all, or like just maintaining between our two ears, it kind of reminds me of this observation, the kind of neuroscientific idea that it's all coming from the brain in some sense. But then our awareness can actually change the brain, right? So we can do certain things that actually affect our own neuroplasticity, which is another way of saying awareness is not reducible to the brain because it actually is something that can change the brain. So where does that sort of freedom come from?
A very good point. Yeah. And I'm not sophisticated enough about the science to get into it in any deep way, but more and more of the people in the neurosciences are open to the possibility that consciousness is not just an epiphenomenon, a result of brain activity, but that has existence independent of the brain, and the brain might be more of a transformer or like a TV set.
Yeah, a mediating function. Yeah.
Consciousness comes in, is processed there. Yeah. Someone said to me, when you turn on your television, you see people talking to each other. You don't think the television created those people.
Exactly. But if you
and
imagine,
they're not in the box.
Yeah, if you imagine someone just like arriving here on this planet, presuming they had a similar worldview, I suppose, and looking at it, being utterly mystified. I mean, it's a mystifying thing. How do a bunch of waves How does a video, like lifelike image of people go through, some chords and travel through the air and then land in our television set in our living room?
And be converted from
Yeah,
waves into these forms
exactly.
in real time. If you watch a live performance or a ball game or something, that's happening now. Well, look, we're doing it. You're 3,000 miles away across an
Exactly.
ocean, and we're talking and seeing each other. It's
Yeah.
bizarre, but
Yeah.
it's all waves and frequency and vibration that human beings have discovered how to manipulate and use. Well, why would the intelligence of the universe not have the same capacity?
I know. That's such a good, glad we got there, because it's like these sorts of common sense expressions or reflections of this more fundamental truth. It's like we all are experiencing it all the time. It's just the way in which our mindset writes off these otherwise quite miraculous, wondrous, like technological things that are clearly representing or reflecting or expressing what this vibratory interconnectedness that we're talking about. And yet people are just like, oh, well, that's just, modern
I
technology. It
know.
has nothing to do with anything mysterious.
And then we've always been this way. At one point, I had to do some research about the early days of radio. It was this miracle. Well, there's a whole history there where it started out as a military thing of being able to communicate with ships at sea. And then someone had the bright idea, well, wait a minute, you can have an orchestra playing in a box in your own living room. And suddenly we had commercial radios, and people were buying them and turning on the news and turning on a concert. And it was probably seemed miraculous to them. But then they got used to it, and it was just an appliance.
Exactly. That makes me think of, I love the state or the experience of what occurs at that point when a new technology opens up a world. You'll have many more experiences of these technological transformations perhaps than I do, but I'm old enough at least to remember the beginning of the internet and the beginning of email. And I remember I had Juno mail, no longer a thing. And I had to you had to put it as CD-ROM into the
Yeah,
computer, and then it was an application, all this. I remember the first time I sent an email and got one back in like a minute. And I remember sitting there just like,
I
just
know.
a spiritual experience in a way, a light going on of connection.
Yeah.
And this is like not analogous to what happens in certain kinds of states of meditation, which is where I want to, I suppose, go here. Because karma is, of course, we're talking a lot about it as a kind of causal principle and the nature of how things are interconnected in a certain kind of way. But one of the ways in which, we can sort of take it out of the kind of externalizing, moralizing framework is by reminding the listeners that karma is also meant to point to the fact that we have techniques and skills that can transform our karmas. It can actually affect our karmas in the
Right.
same way that, harnessing the awareness and consciousness in a particular way can shape the brain. So yeah, I would love for you to speak about this, where we actually have maybe not an unlimited free will, but we have some kind of free range to manipulate, or rather plant seeds for different karmas. In some traditions, that of course means to completely expire all karmas and then move beyond
Yeah, yeah.
samsara. For others, it might be something else. So could you speak about that?
Yeah, and that's ultimately my book is a practical book, and karma is a practical concept. It's not just, hey, you should know that everything you do affects you and everything that's happening to you now is because of the past. No, it's you have the opportunity, A, to ameliorate the impact of unwanted karma as it comes in by adapting your own consciousness and your own perception, your own reaction to whatever's present. The Bhagavad Gita talks about having equanimity in gain and loss, pleasure and pain, victory and defeat. So we have victory and defeat and pain and loss coming to us all the time. Do we handle them with dignity? Do we handle it with grace? Are we calm and equanimous inside? Are we clear in our minds? All those variables will affect how we experience the karma that comes to us. And at the same time is creating the karma of the future. Everything we do is a causal agent that will create effects. So we have this capacity. So when you look at what the traditions, how they address spiritual development, spiritual growth, which is another way of saying creating, better karma for ourselves in the future, it's layered. It's not, we tend to focus on what we do, our actions. Every action has equal and opposite reaction. So there are behavioral guidelines, the most obvious being, to be kind and to not steal. There are do's and don'ts in every tradition, including, of course, the Judeo-Christian tradition and secular traditions of ethical behavior. And we all know basically right from wrong. But the Eastern traditions then go further, and they say it's not just about the action itself or the speech itself. It's what is the intention underlying it? What is the motivation? What is the thought process? What are the emotions? So those internal conditions are fundamental and foundational to the outward actions and the outward speech. So let's pay attention to that. Let's do what in the West we say, build character. What is the personality, the individual foundation for the thoughts and actions that arise? So we can modify our behavior, and like my grandmother used to say, be nice, and be more kind, be more generous, be more compassionate. Don't take advantage of people, don't steal, don't do these things. So those are ethical considerations, behavioral considerations. But then it's the thoughts and the attitudes and the motivations. So there's a big difference between someone breaking into your house and stealing things and a woman whose child is hungry shoplifting a candy bar. They're both stealing, but there's a big difference there. There's a big difference between you expressing condolences to somebody who had a loss when it's sincere, as opposed to, well, I have to say this and I really don't care. There's a big difference there. So we have to pay attention to those things. And there are methods in the yogic traditions and in the Buddhist traditions, although you could say the same, for doing that, for adjusting thought, for adjusting intention. The term sankalpa is used for, having right intention, right speech, and so forth. And then on a fundamental level, it's like, well, how can we attack these things at the foundational level of what we are as discrete human beings, independent of the fact that ultimately we're all one and there's no separation and all that, but we're living our lives as discrete Jacobs and Phils. And so how can we get to the deepest level of that in transformative ways so that you could say our default setting, our internal GPS, our internal guidance is more likely to think and act and perceive in ways that give rise to better karma, to good effect in the world, so that it accrues to our benefit, our growth and evolution. So that's where the spiritual technologies come in. What in the West we would think of maybe as psycho-spiritual technologies, meditation being chief among them, and the physical practices of yoga that neutralize the buildup of past impressions that we call samskaras and alleviate physically, you could say, from the nervous system or from the subtle body, these deep impressions of the past, so that the conditioning of karma is ameliorated or reduced, and so that we're more likely to show up in the world with a bigger heart and greater compassion and a big, clearer thinking, more accurate perception, and so forth. So we can address the issue of how to create better karma in the future and neutralize the deliveries that are still on the way and they arise by addressing our own personal development on all these levels. And to me, the goal is because we don't always have the opportunity to think through our choices. Some we do, I'm planning a vacation or, I'm going, whatever it is. But, we're making choices and decisions spontaneously all the time. So how can we change our default setting so we naturally and intuitively do the right thing? It's one thing for my grandmother to say, be nice, but, it didn't stop me from being naughty. So,
did you grow up in a religious?
no, a very anti-religious household. I didn't see
So
any.
you were transgressive in moving towards spirituality.
That's right. Right. I had to unlearn rigorous atheism and secularism. Other people have to unlearn, erroneous kind of theologies and
Absolutely.
religiosity.
Some people have to unlearn both.
Yeah, that's right.
Because some people leave that certain religious orthodoxy for a kind of religious secularism in a way, or orthodox materialism, we could say. And then you have to show the middle path, I guess. I wanted to, as a last kind of gesture, reflection, to move us into some slightly political territory, since you did it to me on your podcast. After we had that conversation, I was like, I was like, oh gosh, did I say too much? Could I have put it a different way? But actually, when I listened back, it was okay. So hopefully I haven't gotten canceled yet. I didn't say anything cancelable, you guys who are listening.
No.
So I wanted to ask, in the spirit of this conversation of kind of karma and what kinds of karmas we are generating right now, when we look, if we just go back a little bit historically, you were even speaking earlier about this moment in the 60s when there were literally thousands of people at Madison Square Garden to see a guru. Something that is unheard of today. It's absolutely unheard of. And, when I was growing up, the spirituality of the 60s, the political mindset of the 60s was really romanticized. Even though to some degree there was yes, it was also fraught with violence and conflict. But in a lot of ways, the mythology of the 60s was, for me growing up, very positive. And on that level of spirituality, it did seem very positive by comparison today, where that kind of a popularity is much more difficult to encourage. Now, we could ask, well, maybe the popularity was a bad thing because a lot of people were there because it was hip and trendy to do or whatever. But it certainly seems that things have shifted. And it takes a lot for people to be open to spirituality now. And part of that is the good kind of maturation of our political mindset, where we no longer are exoticizing the East in the same way. We are much more kind of mature and realistic, I think, about the beauty. And also, we can see it with maybe clearer eyes rather than just sort of, trying to find in the quote unquote East what we were missing in the West. And then there's also the very real reality of abuse and all of these things that have happened that have pushed people away, or maybe people overly skeptical or overly constrained when it comes to even being open to spirituality. And then at the same time, there's also this sort of political shift that's happened, which has good aspects, and I would say also some not so good ideological aspects. I think in comparison to Gen X, which is like, don't give me any labels. Don't label me. I am my own creation kind of thing. And now the shift is that I am my labels. I am my neurodivergent diagnosis. I am all of the predications of my labels and identities. And insofar as those are challenged, I am being violated. So my question with regards to all of this, and maybe they're sort of two entirely different topics, but as these things sort of congeal, what is it that we are karmically generating now, karmically producing? And what kind of reincarnation do we have in store?
Oh, thank you, Jacob. Well, earlier I used the word unfathomable.
Yeah.
The karmic conditions, the collective karma, unfathomable. I'll come back to the spiritual part, but the political, socio-political situation we're in begs for an explanation of what the hell is America's collective karma that could possibly have given rise to this mess. And of course, there's no easy answer. You could say, we're reaping the fruits of racism and genocide of Native Americans and colonialism and all that. And well, okay, maybe so, but it's much more complicated than that. And maybe our karma made the population complacent and self-involved, so people weren't paying attention and bad actors could assume power. Maybe it's as simple as that, maybe, but it's complex. And I hear spiritual people addressing it in different ways, and sometimes I want to scream. It's like, oh, this is all good, and it's, a cleansing. You have to have a cleansing before the purification, and you have to, whatever, and there's a new age will come out of this mess. And that's a leap of faith I'm not willing to make, and I think it's a mistake to, even if you believe, as Martin Luther King did, that, the arc of the moral universe bends toward justice, it doesn't mean we don't have to do some of the bending ourselves. It's not necessarily automatic. And that long, length of time maybe can be shortened. So I don't like spiritual explanations that end up being an excuse for disengagement or a lack of concern. You could say people are, how'd you put it, less inclined, less open to spirituality. You could make the exact same, the opposite argument. Back when I first became aware of the Eastern traditions, when the Beatles went to India and meditation and mantra and guru became a thing, and the cover stories of magazines, which would be the equivalent of a viral video now or something, it was new. So there are still popular gurus coming here from India. COVID, changed a lot of that. But people like, the guru who's called Amma and Sri Ravi Shankar, some of the modern gurus, they were coming here every year and doing tours and attracting large numbers of people.
Yeah. I've received several hints from her.
Madison Square Garden, but it could be, 1,500 people in a hotel ballroom. But it didn't get news because it's commonplace now. And now we have shows like yours and podcasts like mine and all this information available, yoga studios everywhere, places like Kripalu and Omega and Esalen and online workshops and all that. So you could say that spirituality is kind of normalized now. It's not a novelty as it once was. And I run to people all the time. They don't have anything to do with surrendering to a guru or anything. Lessons have been learned about that. But they still seek out teachers, and they still seek out information, and they still look to people like your faculty on embodied philosophy and whoever else, even me, who know something they don't. So there's a lot of seeking and a lot of inquisitiveness, and they're still misbehaving gurus. I'm on the board of the Association for Spiritual Integrity because stuff keeps happening, which is, bringing us back to karma and knowing right from wrong not being enough. All the misbehaving gurus and all the misbehaving priests and ministers and all that who have taken advantage of people know they're doing wrong.
Yeah.
They teach people ethics and right behavior, and yet they still have misbehaved. So we have to attack these things on deeper levels.
Yeah.
But anyway, that's a digression. So I don't know what the future is. I get encouraged every once in a while. We're recording this a week or 10 days after an election that was very encouraging in the U.S.
A socialist mayor of New York. Can you believe it?
Yeah. Well, we'll see how socialistic he can be in that context.
Totally.
But
Totally.
a smart and sincere and charismatic young man with a Muslim background, being accused of being an operative for jihadists or something. And, here's New York. I was born and raised in New York. So this was right in the tradition of in-your-face New Yorkers saying, I want something different.
Yeah. Yeah, it does feel very in alignment with that. Well, I really actually appreciate your characterization of the state of things in terms of the way spirituality has become normalized. You're absolutely right. And it's a very kind of optimistic view because, like you said, it's not necessarily that we are no longer in a time when gurus can attract stadiums full of people. It's that now the access points for spirituality are so diversified and so integrated and so, as you say, normalized and sort of naturalized that there's just so many places to go for a lot of people.
And that has its downside too, as you know, because there's a lot of charlatans and a lot
Yeah.
of self-anointed enlightened gurus don't necessarily have the expertise or the skill set or the sincerity. So people have to be very discerning in a marketplace like this. But that was
Yeah.
always the case.
Yeah, when I've heard Paul speak about these things, the way he characterizes what he might see as the challenge amidst all of this is that even though there's a diversity of access points, there's not a lot of real depth in terms of like sustained attention to practice, like the sense that, the understanding of meditation that understands that the effects are cumulative. It's not that you just sit down and all of a sudden you're enlightened. And people don't like to engage in such things very often because they're looking for a quick fix prescription. And that's sort of very characteristic of our modern day culture. But still, insofar as people are seeking, I'm a bit optimistic as well in that the Shakti does the work of drawing people ever more inexorably towards truth. And it's inevitable that people will wake up in some way.
And the traditions get diluted and trivialized and misused, but truth comes through. And I'm always heartened but when the Hatha Yoga boom was at its peak. Now it's just part of the culture. But there was a lot of lamenting, including by me, that, yoga is being diluted. It's being reduced to physical fitness. It's all these classes on bending and stretching and asana practice and no deep meditation and no philosophy. That's not entirely true. And people might go to a yoga class because they want to lose weight or be more flexible or meet their soulmate or whatever, but they might hear that there's more to it. And they may get a glimpse of something deep and transcendent spontaneously in a class and say, what was that? And I want to know more. And, some of the leading yoga teachers were people who went into a yoga class because they had back pain. And then they ended up becoming sincere devotees.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly how I ended up here. I went into a yoga class because a few friends were raving about it. And I went to a gym class, and now 20 years later, I'm sitting here talking to you about these esoteric matters. And I also respond to people who kind of lament this sort of thing. Even now, when you encounter people, it's like, it's so horrible. It's like, this is a gateway. If we really take the traditions at their word, like, we are not doing things here. We didn't do this. Some mysterious hand of grace has manifested this popular kind of orientation toward embodied spiritualized movement in a particular way that just created a funnel for hundreds of thousands of people, if not millions, to find esoteric wisdom traditions that can actually transform their lives. And so who are we to challenge that movement of the Shakti, which is utterly beyond any individual or collective? It's karma.
Right.
In a way.
And, and what effect that upsurge or that deepening of spirituality in the West. And we have to include in this, Jacob, I've just interviewed for my podcast a rabbi about Jewish mysticism. And I've had on my program, and you have too, no doubt, people who are deeply into contemplative Christianity. And the teachings of the mystics are undergoing a great renewal. And that's all the result of people learning from the Eastern traditions about transformative spiritual practices and saying, isn't that in my heritage too? Aren't there teachings like this? And just rediscovering them and putting them in a context that is comfortable for different personalities and groups. All this is happening. How it will affect the political landscape and the growing authoritarianism and horror show that plays itself out in immigrant communities and so forth, I don't know. But it's part of the equation, and I'm glad it's there. I just hope, people don't get complacent in their, newfound inner peace.
Beautiful. Well, that was a really nice way to end, but I wanted to kind of ask you, I mean, maybe you agree or disagree with this, but I imagine you agree since you taught a course before about yoga and arts for body philosophy. I can't remember
right.
exactly, it was several years ago now, that every kind of process of writing a book is a reflection of your own spiritual experience, contemplative process. So I'm curious, what have you learned? What has transformed as a result of writing this recent book?
One of the things I learned is that after all these books, it's still not easy. and the subject matter always becomes more complicated than you realize. But the result is you know so much more. And I have a greater appreciation for, the traditions I had to dive into and discover the diversity in. But how has it affected me and my growth? I am much more obvious, I'm much more conscious of karma. You think about something this long and you contemplate it and write about it and explain it to others, I'm much more likely to think, well, wait a minute, before I make that decision, karma. And to think in those terms. Also, I never had a problem of disciplining myself to do my sadhana, but I get lapse and thinking, oh, the book put me back in a place where I'm more likely to be consistent in my practices. So I think that's about what I can say.
Those are pretty brilliant fruits of the karma that you've invested in this book. So I just wanted to remind people again that I've been talking to Phil Goldberg about his new book, Karmic Relief. Is it available for purchase as yet?
Yeah. It's out. It's officially published a month now.
Oh, incredible. Okay, great. Well, then this will come out in a perfect time. You can find it in all of the usual stores, online and elsewhere?
I hope elsewhere, but certainly online. I hope your local bookstore is carrying it, but they can certainly order it for you.
Excellent. Where else can people find you, Phil? And is there anything else that's on the horizon?
Yeah, my website is my name, Philip, with one L, Goldberg.com. My Substack is called Practical Spirituality. My podcast, where you'll find Jacob and many other wise people, is called Spirit Matters.
Excellent. Yes. Dip into all of those. Phil has been doing his podcast longer than I've been doing Shitheads, and more consistently, I might add.
You have a far more clever name, though.
Yeah, I was just young and provocative enough, just arrogant enough to choose a name like that. I was saying the other day to Nataraj, actually, who I was dating at the time, and it was his idea. Actually, it was his name, and I loved it. And I've always sort of liked being transgressive, but I was saying now, I don't know that I would have chosen that, just given like the way that people are so easily inflamed by things, but I'm glad I did. But anyway, Phil, it's been such a delight to speak with you again. I'm so glad we had this. Sorry it took a while for me to, not be a kind of disorganized mess, but I'm so glad that we got a chance to chat. And look forward to the next one.
I'm glad. I'm delighted always to talk with you, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk about the book and karma with your faithful listeners.
Thank you, Phil. I have been speaking once again to Phil Goldberg, author of his new book, Karmic Relief. Thank you for listening to Chitheads, and we'll see you next time.